so much. It's a pleasure to meet you all, and thank you so much for having me today. I'm Michelle Benzing, as Shayla just introduced me, environment consultant with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And while Katrin can't be here, she sends her apologies that she is not with us today, but of course wishes us a good evening and a good conversation. Yes, I am currently environment consultant, but I'm also a member of Young WILPF, the network of WILPF, and I'm also a member of WILPF Germany. And I consider myself as a feminist peace activist and intersectional environmentalist. So today we will talk about the participation of WILPF at the 28th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or better known as the UNFCCC. And as COP28 came to a close on December 13th, last year already, and after nearly 2 weeks of negotiations and talks and actions, and with the WILPF delegation really actively participating throughout those 2 weeks, I want to offer you some analysis and insights and personal reflections around the challenges and wins that we face, in particular as it relates to our work on centering demilitarization for gender and climate justice. As was said before, I prepared a presentation for around 30 minutes, which will be separated in these 3 different parts. So the background on the COP process, so basically covering what is COP, what are the negotiations, who are the participants. Then secondly, WILPF's participation as a feminist peace organization, looking at our objectives, our role at the conference, but also who was part of our delegation. And then lastly, reflecting on the outcomes, particularly linking the different outcomes to what was achieved regarding demilitarization. I will leave some time in between these 3 different sections so that you can ask any questions, like comprehensive questions between each section. And if we want to dive deeper into a discussion, we can do that then afterwards, after the 3 parts, basically. So I would like to start on the COP processes. Who of you have heard about the Conference of the Parties, the COP? Maybe by a show of hands, you can just sign. Okay, that's amazing. And who of you has been following the negotiations last year for COP28? If not, that's not a problem. We will cover everything today. I just want to see who's been engaging so far. Okay, some of you as well. Wow, okay, so I have a very knowledgeable participants here. So please bear with me. I hope not to bore anyone, but I just want to kind of introduce some ground basics for everyone to follow along tonight. So COP stands for the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC. And the UNFCCC entered into force on the 21st of March, 1994. The aim of the convention is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations, and I quote, at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic, so human-induced, interference with the climate system. Until now, 198 nations have ratified the convention, and they are called parties to the convention. And basically, this convention was the first step to recognize that there was a problem, that we do need to address the climate crisis. We do also have the Kyoto Protocol, which is an international agreement under the UNFCCC, discussed in 1997 and came into effect in 2005. It basically commits parties to binding emissions reductions, and it follows a very important principle while doing so. And the abbreviation is CBDR. It stands for Common but Differentiated Responsibilities. And what this basically says is that some countries are more responsible for the climate crisis than others due to their historic greenhouse gas emissions, and others are most affected by the climate crisis. And the Kyoto Protocol basically put the burden on the developed countries who have been continuously contributing to the climate crisis for them to really reduce their emissions. Next, we also do have the Paris Agreement, which you probably have heard of at some point, which was adopted in Paris in 2015. And it basically builds upon the convention. What's important and different to the Kyoto Protocol is that it asks all nations to undertake ambitious efforts to combat the climate crisis and also to adapt to its effects. And it does so by also including enhanced support to assist developing countries or those most affected through climate finance and also the loss and damage fund that we have right now to mitigate, but also adapt to the impact of the climate crisis. Basically, the goal of the Paris Agreement is to keep global temperature rise this century well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase even further to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So what is then this COP process? So basically each year, all the different parties to the convention are coming together at the Conference of the Parties to track this goal of the Paris Agreement yearly and to engage in a collective progress where we review emissions reductions plans and where negotiations are being held to further create plans to reduce emissions, but also to adapt to the climate crisis, to establish mechanisms to pay up for losses and damages, and to also provide climate finance to those most in need and most affected by the climate crisis. So last year, what was special about COP28 is that we had the global stocktake. The global stocktake is basically a process to take stock of the Paris Agreement. So it's a comprehensive review of the collective progress made by the countries towards achieving the Paris Agreement's goals. And this takes place typically every 5 years and basically involves assessing global efforts to limit global warming. And this GST, as the abbreviation stands, has been the first time taking place last year. I will further get back to the GST later, particularly when we look at the reflections of the outcomes, because it plays a very important role in the outcome document of this COP28. So next on to who actually attends such a conference of the parties. So as I mentioned before, we do have the parties to the convention, the 194 member states, and they are organizing themselves in different groupings, such as, for example, the G77 in China, the European Union, the Environment Integrity Group, which is a group consisting out of countries like Mexico, Liechtenstein, Georgia, Switzerland, and others. The Arab group, there are various basically negotiation groups who are coming together to negotiate as a group and have more say, depending on the different negotiation tracks. So that means we do have the negotiators at the conference, and at some points we also have the heads of states at the conference participating, particularly at the World Leader Summit, which is usually at the beginning of the conference, like the second or third day. Which is like a special process, basically, where all the world leaders are also doing their statements. Then, besides the parties, we do have the observers. So basically, WILPF, as an international NGO, is one of those observers. And we as observers are organized in 9 different constituencies. We do, for example, have BINGO, which is the business and industry NGOs, ENGO, the environmental NGOs. We have the IPO, the indigenous peoples organizations, the LGMA, the local government and municipal authorities, RINGO, which stands for Research and Independent NGOs, TANGO for trade unions, YANGO for children and youth organizations, and then lastly, the WGC, which is the Women and Gender constituency. And we as WILPF are a member of the Women and Gender constituency and mostly contribute to organizing basically with other feminist organizations in the COP process. But we are also a member of CAN, the Climate Action Network, which is part of the environment NGOs. And I think for WILPF, that's particularly important because we're trying to engage with different constituencies who are, of course, aligned with our mission of demilitarization for climate justice. And we are actually also built up a cross-constituency working group on peace and demilitarization, which is under the umbrella of the Women and Gender constituency, but which really also tries to engage, for example, with the indigenous peoples organizations and other environmental groups. Besides the observers who are basically, we are allowed to observe the negotiations. So that means we can go into official negotiation talks. But once there are informal negotiations between member states, we're not allowed anymore to participate. But we do have the chance to give inputs, for example, through interventions during negotiations or also written inputs. Besides those, we also have the media, of course, present, who's covering the negotiations and protests, as well as UN staff who are helping to organize the conference, often supporting the presidency, but also UN staff from other bodies, such as UN Women, for example. And then we do have also lobbyists present at the conference. You probably heard that there was actually a new research from the campaign Kick Big Polluters Out, and they found out that there were around 2,456 fossil fuel representatives and lobbyists at COP28, which is a massive number. Actually, it was 4 times more compared to COP27, to the conference taking place in Sharm el-Sheikh, which shows that the number of fossil fuel lobbyists is definitely increasing. And we can talk about this later on when we, maybe discuss a little bit as well, how effective is the process and, how is the process also sometimes undermined. But just to say one more time that this number of over 2,400 fossil fuel lobbyists is more than all the delegates brought by the 10 most climate vulnerable countries. So we also see how those most affected are least represented in those spaces, while those really, trying to make fossil fuel deals have a huge representation. And it's good that we have these numbers and we have this transparency now. That was actually a huge win by civil society, which happened last year at the Bonn Climate Change Conference, which always happens in the interim, so in June. To the first time to really have this transparency, because with transparency comes also accountability. But yeah, there's still a lot to do. And maybe one last point on participation. So we also saw a lack of women participation at COP28. It largely pointed out to the absence when it comes to discussing the future of the planet. And actually just 38% of all delegates were women. And only 10% of the 140 speakers at the World Climate Action Summit were women. So we do really see the lack of representation here as well when it comes to the conference. I'm going to stop here for a second just to see if you have any questions on the points I just made before I jump into explaining a little bit more what we as the WILPF delegation did during the conference.
Could I ask you to say a bit more, explain a bit more about the observer groups? Are those nicknames provided by the NGOs, or are they formal groupings of what you mentioned, indigenous, trade unions, youth, and so on?
Yeah, so those are those are names basically, or abbreviations for the different groupings, and those are formal groups. So they're formally recognized under the UNFCCC. And at the moment there's 9, but there's actually a process for more groups to be established, but it is a long process of recognition. For example, there are organizations of people with disabilities trying to get recognized as like an official constituency. as well as religious groups who are trying to get representation. So yeah, it's kind of like an official, recognition
Yeah,
of NGOs.
thank you. Leslie.
Thank you. This is incredibly useful. You know, what one knows sort of a lot of it, but seeing it logically like this. So thank you, Michelle. My question, which maybe you want to answer later, is every time we have this thing about lack of women as key speakers and negotiators, was anything put up saying that in future there must be at least 40% women, 40% men as key speakers, or any type of framework? Or because it's no use just waiting for fish to grow feet, if I could put it this way. It goes on, and maybe something WILPF could take aboard, and somehow I think we have to be far more. But I just wondered, was this sort of thing discussed? It's no use saying they should bring more, because it won't happen organically, at least not for our lifetimes. Maybe yours, Michelle.
I hope so. Unfortunately, I didn't see any kind of quota that had been put into place. I do think, though, you know, there was a lot of these, you maybe saw these pictures of all these heads of states, you know, walking along and, you know, being the picture of the COP. So I think there is like increased awareness. Unfortunately, it doesn't come from the process, but particularly the women and gender constituency is, of course, pushing for more representation. There are also the women and the Women Development Organization, WIDO is the abbreviation. They are working on increasing capacities of women to engage in these processes. They're also trying to work closely with women negotiators so that they can take up more leadership roles and really enhance their presence. And I do know that so we do have gender negotiations under the Lima framework. There's not really a discussion of a quota, but of course, like it always comes up to have more representation. There's also more increased awareness against, like harassment and gender-based violence at the conference, because there was actually like a case at the Bonn Climate Change Conference that negotiators were harassed. So it is taken upon the UNFCCC and the president.
So in effect, there's no, sorry to interrupt you, but
Yeah.
I didn't want to take up too much time
Oh.
on this, but is there any mechanism by which WILPF and other organizations, whether it's women and men, whatever, could put forward some sort of proposal to say for the next COP, there has to be a sort of thing of that speakers should be, let's say, for example, at least 40% men, at least 40% women, and the other 20% can be either or, some specific proposal for a framework. Is there any way that this could be done? Question mark.
I think one could probably raise it to the UNFCCC. I would have to look into connecting us or WILPF with WIDO one more time. You know, if we say this is a priority for us, I think they're a good organization to address, and they might know more about the processes behind that. Unfortunately, I focus more on the demilitarization aspect, but I think we can definitely try to get into contact.
Thank
and, you know, if you were willing to work on it, we would love to see some proposals so that we can get in contact with other organizations with the women and gender constituency, or join the women and gender constituency yourself so you can bring it up. That would be actually amazing as well.
But why is it always the women having to bring it up? That's my question.
I know,
the men have the obligation to bring it up. And that's why I'm saying, what can we, is there some way that WILPF could produce a list of where the key points are that you could put this proposal? I'm just, what's the mechanism? Because it is a very complicated mechanism. Listening to you, I realize how very complicated the mechanism is to try and work your way through it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think for now,
I'll
you know,
back off
feel
now.
free to maybe put it down in an email as well to Katrin, and we're happy to take it up as a proposal and discuss it then further with other organizations who might have a little bit more insights on these processes. I think that's really what's needed, so that we know, you know, where to best go and address.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Michelle. Do you want to move on to your second area?
Yes, I'm just looking if Paula and Helen, is it maybe short, comprehensive questions? Then I might just take them and then we continue on.
Paula?
Thanks, I'll jump in. Mine is, in your opinion, do you think you have enough opportunity in the process to get WILPF's message across? And that might not be a quick answer, and you can answer later, but that's mine.
I will actually take that up in the next part. So
Okay.
maybe a few more seconds and I will touch upon that.
Okay.
And
Who
then,
else is that?
And then
Helen?
a quick one for me, it's more of a comment. It's really interesting, everything that you're saying. I've been really shocked by this 2,400 fossil fuel lobbyists. It seems an extraordinary number and so disproportionate. So I'm just kind of reeling from that statistic. Thank you.
Yeah, trust me, it's also, you know, it's, yeah, not a shock, but like we're not surprised anymore, but it's really something we have to address because there's a huge conflict of interest for these fossil fuel lobbyists to be actually at the conference. All right, I think with that, I might jump into my second part. And I want to just quickly share with you some pictures. Give me 1 second. I think you should be able to see just a quick presentation. So we had the beginning. Yes, I just wanted to show you some pictures of the lovely delegation. So now we're jumping into the second part, which is more about WILPF's participation and role as a feminist peace organization at the conference. So here we will touch upon who is in the delegation and what were our objectives at the conference. So we've participated at the COP28 with a delegation of 5 feminist peace activists, who you can see here. We do have Rula Assad, who is a feminist researcher and journalist. She's the co-founder of the Stitching Female Journalist Network from Syria. And with over 2 decades of experience, she brings a dedication to decolonial and intersectional feminist perspectives and had various roles from facilitator and trainer and journalist as well. Secondly, we have Nesma Mansour, who's the advocacy officer of the Peace Track initiative. She's a woman, peace and security expert and the founding member of the PTI. And she specializes in the intersection of peace building and climate justice, and is also the focal point for feminist climate justice. And PTI is actually a huge partner of WILPF, just to mention that as well. Next, we also have Ola Al-Sakaf, who's a Yemeni researcher and a climate activist and founder of Peace Environment for Development. She's also a part of WILPF Yemen, and she is also a member of Young WILPF, so bringing in the youth perspectives. And then, of course, we have Katrin there, who's the environment advisor at the International Secretariat of WILPF, and myself. So just for you to basically quickly see our delegation. I'm just hopping over to this. Sorry, give me 1 second. I'm just back to my notes. All right, so now I want to talk about the different advocacy vision that we also had within WILPF. So basically, we really wanted to put the topic of demilitarization for gender and climate justice on the agenda, which means we want to forge a narrative shift for the topic of demilitarization to be included in official UNFCCC outcome documents as an essential component for climate justice. The vision was also to further widen and introduce a wide range of civil society movements to understand the importance of addressing demilitarization in the context of climate justice, and to include these calls into their demands and advocacy. And lastly, it was also our idea to work with so-called peace champions, which are countries who, you know, already put the topic on the agenda, and that will center the issue of demilitarization within the climate space. We did have some entry points this year at COP28, which were particularly special. So on December 3rd, for example, we had the first ever thematic day for health, relief, recovery, and peace. And at that day, the COP presidency actually launched the COP28 declaration, Climate Relief, Recovery, and Peace, as well as a package of solutions. And while the mobilization of climate action in conflict-affected countries and communities is super crucial, we wanted to address the elephant in the room, which is rampant militarization. So there were actually a few key messages that we constantly wanted to highlight. We wanted to talk firstly about military emissions. So we do know that the global military activity contributes significantly to global greenhouse gas emissions. But this is largely overlooked in the climate debate. According to recent estimates, the military sector could be responsible for around 5.5% of total emissions worldwide, yet there is a lack of transparency and accountability when it comes to the reporting on military greenhouse gas emissions under the UNFCCC. We also put a focus on military spending because we know in 2022, global military spending actually rose to an all-time high of around $2.24 trillion. And this actually correlates with increased military emissions. And this military spending further diverts resources away from conflict-sensitive and gender-transformative climate action. And if redirected, we actually said they could be instrumental in advancing critical initiatives. For example, 1 year's military spending by the top 10 military spenders would pay for the promised international climate finance for 15 years.
Oh,
if you do want some more information, I would recommend you to go to this link. You actually have it on your website as well, which says 10 things you need to know about demilitarization for climate justice. Because I do want to, not dive deeper into these connections, but to look at what we really demanded the states. So basically what we asked also different member states to do is to find routes by which military spending can be reallocated to climate finance. We also demanded a formal submission to the IPCC Task Force on National Greenhouse Gas Inventories, basically to elaborate rules for reporting on military and conflict-related emissions under the Paris Agreement and in the context of the enhanced transparency framework. We also demanded for an IPCC special report on climate change and military activity. So these are kind of like our visions, our goals with which we went into the conference. And in order to achieve these different goals, we tried to do different activities. And for that, I'm gonna share my screen one more time because I want to show you some pictures of the different activities that we did. So WILPF hosted and participated in a wide range of in-person but also virtual events over the course of COP28, where we were addressing the intersections of demilitarization for climate justice from various angles. And what was special is that we combined global data with the analysis of lived experiences, particularly of our delegates from Yemen and Syria. We also coordinated a working group on peace and demilitarization within the Women and Gender constituency, which is one of the 9 stakeholders to the UNFCCC. And the WILPF delegation also participated in many demonstrations of solidarity. And as you can see here, so this was an action on demilitarization we actually organized within the Peace and Demilitarization Working Group. And here we participated in demonstrations of solidarity with the people of Palestine, which shed light on the atrocities being inflicted on the Palestinian people, standing in solidarity and demanding a ceasefire as well at the conference. We also participated in different negotiations, and I actually had the chance to deliver a statement on behalf of the Women and Gender constituency in regards to long-term climate finance. And here on the right-hand side, you can also see my friend Aishka and me delivering our final statement for the women and gender constituency in front of all the different negotiation members at the end of the conference. It was the last statement delivered. Then, you can see some more protests, particularly also for an equitable fossil fuel phase out, but also addressing the militarism as the elephant in the climate room. And we also were present in various media outlets, constantly delivering on the message. And we had an article published in the Echo, which is the most widely read daily newsletter from Climate Action Network, the largest climate justice coalition in the world, where we basically reflected why or how we really have to address militarism in the climate space. And maybe to just, conclude on the section and just to reflect. So while the topic of demilitarization has not yet made it to the official negotiations at COP, we have seen actually an increasing number of references and of leaders and also civil society addressing and making the connections between demilitarization and climate justice. For example, also the president of Brazil, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, emerged from a high-level meeting stating, and I quote, "It is unacceptable that the promise of 100 billion a year made by the developed countries will not come to fruition, while in 2021 alone, military spending reached 2.2 trillion. So you can really see that heads of state are already aware on the issue, and that comes through the advocacy work of WILPF, but also other organizations. And we really see a momentum currently to hold different actors and stakeholders accountable. So this is actually quite promising. Of course, and maybe just to come back to your question, it's not yet enough, right? We're not yet there, but I would say WILPF is at a very promising point of raising the awareness, and particularly with this peace and demilitarization working group, where we can bring together different people who are also impacted by militarization and the climate crisis. We can continuously more address the issue, and at some point, hopefully also bring it within the declaration that they had this year at COP, but also within the other different negotiation tracks. And why I also wanted to, show you the members of our delegation is just because I wanted to highlight that they were also active in the MENA Feminist Task Force, because this year the MENA Feminists were really leading the work of the Women and Gender Constituency. And it's so important because also through their leadership, they put the topic of demilitarization onto the agenda. And they were also constantly addressing that in regards to solidarity with the Palestinian people. So maybe I stop here again and just open for your questions before we jump into the last part.
Did you enjoy it?
I see Anne also raising their hand.
Anne, go ahead. I think you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thank you, Michelle. It's interesting to get a different perspective, to get all this detail. But I'm just intrigued by seeing your pictures, and it's lovely to see the all women panels and everything. But are the audience members all women, or do you find that there are men coming into, or is it women talking to women?
It really depends on the event, particularly in the women gender constituency, we're mostly represented by women and non-binary people. Some men as well. It really depends on the event. I would say a majority of women are mostly joining, but we do also have men present, and particularly also from the other organizations. There are often men addressing the issues now and joining in. So I think we're getting there.
Thank you.
this isn't a question so much as to draw the attention of the rest of us to information that appeared in The Guardian yesterday, which actually I understand came initially from Scientists for Global Responsibility. And it's an analysis of the incredible cost that the military expenditure in Gaza over the first 2 months of the war, they make comparisons with the budgets of several countries and so on. And I encourage people to look that up. It's called Climate Cost, Conflict Has Caused Huge Emissions Study Finds. And it's an absolute vindication of WILPF's thrust at COP28. There you are. Beatrice has just put the link on the so that you can pick it up if you haven't seen it. Online, there is much more detail than in the article itself.
Yes, thank you so much for raising this. And I think it's an incredible or like important research. It basically also says that the first month of the conflict basically produced more planet warming than the 20 climate vulnerable nations do in a year. So it makes like these comparisons. So it's incredibly important to raise that, while also, of course, recognizing the impacts on the lives of people, not only, you know, reflecting them in emissions or counting them emissions, but really looking at the impacts of every single person.
Absolutely.
If there are not any questions yet, that's totally fine. I would just go into the last part, which reflects on the outcomes of the COP28 and particularly looks at the outcomes from a feminist peace perspective. So just to explain, you can definitely find more elaborative outcome, like analysis of each individual outcomes on mitigation, adaptation, and so on online, but I really want to do this from a peace perspective. And to start, I want to raise the Declaration for Climate Recovery, Relief, and Peace one more time. So as I said before, this was the first time that we ever had a thematic day of peace. And on December 3rd, the Declaration for Climate Recovery, Relief, and Peace was launched, along with a package of solutions which 74 countries and 40 organizations endorsed. And while the declaration is super important because it does provide, or it talks about providing more financial means to communities affected by conflict and the climate crisis, it has a very narrow focus on this thematic topic. And thereby, I would say from an analysis, neglects the need to address rampant militarization. However, during the launch of the declaration, Foreign Minister Alvaro Levea of Colombia actually noted, and I quote, that it is necessary to talk about global peace, otherwise we are wasting our time. So again, this shows that there is a recognition that and this is what WILPF is continuously doing, we need to address the root causes, because otherwise initiatives like the declaration are in vain if countries continuously continue to go to war, because then we will also continuously to raise awareness about paying climate finance to conflict affected contexts if we continue to have more and more increasing conflict. Secondly, I wanted to go back to the global stocktake that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation and military emissions. So as I said, COP28 featured the first global stocktake. And while we do have the peace declaration that I just mentioned, the final outcome of the GST, which basically everyone looked at because it was the first time that we ever had this process, does not include any language on conflict prevention in the context of climate justice. In other versions of the text beforehand, it was actually still in there, but it was cut out when we got to the final version of the text. Also regarding fossil fuels, so a huge topic from civil society at COP28 was actually raising awareness and demanding an equitable fossil fuel phase out. And while some countries toasted this historic global stocktake, as it mentioned the need to transition away from fossil fuels, those most affected by the climate crisis, and particularly our feminist sisters and brothers from Pacific Island countries, were actually in tears. The COP consensus, or how I rather call it sometimes, the COP compromise, opens the door really to harmful technologies such as carbon capture and storage, nuclear energy, and other fall solutions. And I think for us, it's just really important to state that, you know, we really stand in solidarity with those who reject this kind of celebration of an outcome of the conference, and we will continue to hold the line. But I also want to say that the fact that in this text, we have a mention of a just, orderly, and equitable transition away from fossil fuels, this is a huge win which comes through civil society. It's because civil society stood in front of these doors, made, you know, continuous demands for a just transition away from fossil fuels, that this is finally included in the text. So while this outcome is of course not enough, we also have to recognize that we can really push for better outcomes. We do have a say, we do have an influence of how these negotiations are going. In regards to military emissions, if we overlook the call to a fossil fuel phase out, we also continue to give basically a green light to fossil fuel powered militarization. And WILPF and other organizations had actually made a submission to the GST and asked the GST to recognize the data gap on military and conflict greenhouse gas emissions and demanded effective, transparent, and mandatory reporting of military emissions. This has not been included into the GST, which is of course, you know, a shame, but I think it's really crucial that we made this demand, and we will continue to push for that in future negotiations. Regarding climate finance, so of course, you might have heard that there was the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund on the first day of COP28, which is basically seeking to compensate those countries most vulnerable facing climate-related losses and damages. And while this is, of course, super crucial and very important, the millions pledged so far are not nearly enough to pay for, firstly, the existing losses and damages, and also for those yet to occur. So when we look at the pledges of around $700 million to the Loss and Damage Fund, compared to the $2.24 trillion spent on the military in 2022, we really see, and this underscores the financial discrepancy between these different numbers. And activists at the COP28 continuously asked, why is there always more money for war, but not for the Loss and Damage Fund? So this is all the case while existing commitments such as the $100 million goal remain unfulfilled. And there's also a lack of new financial commitments for climate ambition. And what was very interesting to see is that particularly high-income countries downplayed their historic responsibility, referring to voluntary contributions or the private sector to provide financial means. So if you remember at the beginning, I mentioned this principle of CBDR, of common but differentiated responsibilities. And suddenly we have countries from the global north undermining that principle, basically saying we're not responsible to provide additional or financial means for those who most need it to actually address the climate crisis. And this is highly problematic. Lastly, I just wanted to say, I think the question of provision of climate finance is just a question of prioritization, because we know that the richest countries, which are listed as Annex 2 countries, actually spend 30 times more on their military than on providing climate finance to the most impacted communities. And this really highlights the need for the NCQG, it's called. It's the new collective quantified goal, which will be approved next year at COP. to deliver on needs and science-based demands for new and additional climate finance. So I think for WILPF next year at the COP29 in Azerbaijan, in Baku, there will be a huge focus on this climate finance aspect and linking it to military spending. And just to conclude, so the cross-constituency peace and demilitarization working group is continuously highlighting these challenges and also these discrepancies. And I just wanted to say that we were not only there as, you know, loud activists who are doing actions and raising awareness through protests, which is of course very important, because we saw at the Peace Day, for example, we came together as a delegation, we came together as a group to really highlight the importance of demilitarization. But we were also very much closely following negotiation tracks and trying to influence the text. We came there as experts because we are teaching ourselves how to really engage in these spaces and make contributions that are actually changing the outcome of the conference. And it's very complicated processes. And I think that's also why it's so important for WILPF to be really part of these processes, you know, to know when to hand in what demands and requests for the GST or other negotiation tracks. And yeah, lastly, I wanted to highlight again, you know, the MENA Feminist Task Force and their importance. And I really want to thank all my different delegation members, because it was really due to their activism that we've gotten the topic so far ahead. And I do think that the call for demilitarization for gender and climate justice will remain central to ongoing advocacy efforts. And we, of course, will continue to address the elephant in the room and are already planning to do that at the Bonn Climate Change Conference, which will be happening in June this year. So if you are interested, you know, please join the peace and demilitarization work. Please join the environment working group of WILPF, which is also organizing internationally, so that we can really put this topic onto the agenda. And with that, I would go over to your questions. I know that was a lot of technical nitty-gritty, but I really wanted to give you a good insight into what is all happening and how it's all connected. And I hope you, taking some information with you, and that you are joining us in this call, because we do need a lot of members to really raise awareness.
Thank you very much, Michelle. That was a brilliant outline. Lots and lots of information. I'm sure there are people who want to pursue issues and get Michelle to elaborate on some of the things she said. So put up your hands and let's hear. Go on, Leslie.
Right. It's sounds like a simple question, but it's a humdinger. First of all, thank you. It was a really, really good, comprehensive trot around the whole very complicated process. I knew it was complicated, but I now appreciate how complicated. But my question, actually, it sounds a simple one. Just before I came on this Zoom call, my partner, who has for years supported women's rights and issues and things, said to me, what's the Zoom call you're on? And I said, well, it's gender justice. And I sort of instinctively know what that means, and I'm sure everybody here does. And he said, what does that mean? And I thought, I cannot think of a simple sentence to explain to people what we mean by gender justice in the context of climate change. So Michelle or other people, could we come up with a simple, understandable to people who are not totally involved, but maybe partially involved? How would you define it? Thank you.
Very good, very good.
Thank you, Leslie, for these also, you know, it's good to have these challenging questions and also to think about how we can formulate things in an easier way, because oftentimes we hide behind these, you know, very difficult abbreviations and words. So how would I address gender justice in the context of the climate crisis? I think, I don't know if
how would you define it? If you were talking, say,
yes,
to an intelligent person, let's say a 10-year-old or 12-year-old, or anybody who's not sort of in the inner groups like here, how would you define it? Yeah.
So I would start, and please, you know, you can all then also contribute. I would start by saying that, you know, gender justice in the context of climate crisis, firstly, aims to recognize that there are different impacts of the climate crisis on the lived realities of women and girls and also non-binary people, so that they're differently affected by the climate crisis.
For example, that was, I got as far as that.
Yes.
Then
So,
how was-
for example, we do with you know, oftentimes it's also hard because we do want to have numbers, but oftentimes these numbers are not researched well enough, so we don't really have these sufficient numbers. But one very often cited example is that there are studies which say that women migrants are actually, so for 80% of those migrating due to the climate crisis are women. So that's a huge number of basically climate migrants that, you know, definitely needs to be highlighted. But it's also connected, for example, you know, to their sexual and reproductive health and rights. If, for example, there are droughts and there is a lack of access to water, of course, it affects everyone when it comes to, you know, a lack of drinking water. But it also comes to like a sexual and reproductive health of rights of being able to have products or wash clothing for periods, for example. So there are different impacts that that is happening due to the climate crisis. But also regarding their security, for instance, right? So for instance, if there's a lack of water sources and there's conflict also in the area, women oftentimes face more gender-based violence because they have to actually cross longer distances to get to these resources due to more scarce resources because of the climate crisis. So there are like various examples that one can mention, but I think the second part to my answer would be, it's not only recognizing these different impacts, which is important, but we should not constantly portray women as victims to the climate crisis, because at the same time, it's women leading the responses to the climate crisis, leading the responses to disaster risk management, to and also addressing the impacts of the climate crisis. So seeing them at the forefront is also really important. Yeah, I think these different aspects intersected, and I saw that a lot. I worked in Fiji with a lot of feminists there on climate justice, and it was them organizing to really address the issues of climate crisis for different communities on the ground. And that was very impressive to see their leadership.
Thank you.
Yes, Pat?
Thank you very much for all that. That was absolutely fascinating, Michelle. And it seems to me that one of the most important things that you were talking about was yourselves learning how to make ourselves even more important and more than we had been in the past. And you said that we can get involved in interventions, although we can't be in negotiations. How did you feel that our interventions went? Were you satisfied with them, or did you think we could have done some more?
I think firstly, so the interventions are also always on behalf of the constituency, right? It's not individual groups, but it's basically the whole constituency coming together. But what is then interesting for WILPF is, where do we can we always make a link? You know, put one sentence, even if it's one sentence in there, which links, for example, if it's about climate finance, yes, you also have to address military spending. If it's about mitigation, you know, you also have to look at military emissions. And I do think this happened. We saw that more often, that in these statements, some connection to military, the contribution of the militarization of the climate crisis was addressed. So I think that's an important step forward. And for that, right, we need this connection within the whole constituency, because only if they see the necessity to address the issue, they will also raise it in the interventions. And I think, so in order to give such an intervention, you have to be very involved in the processes. And I think WILPF is only just getting there, because it means to kind of engage in a lot of very technical knowledge. And I really tried to participate in the processes on climate finance and just transition to also show, you know, we're actively engaging in these very hard technical discussions. If I'm satisfied with intervention, it could always be more. The presidency, or like, you know, those leading the negotiations, they're trying to get us in always whenever they get a chance. But oftentimes it's at the end. It's, you know, late at night. It's at the end of like when all the different other parties spoke. So sometimes I wished they would just first listen to the observers for a second and listen to our input before they, you know, started to ramble on about the negotiations, but that's unfortunately not how the process works. But yeah, I do think it's important with every single intervention we're making a change. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, Paula.
Sorry. Yes. Is there any opportunity for the delegates to get back together and produce a very nice, easy read, snappy leaflet we can use for lobbying in the different sections so that before you get to the next one halfway through, we actually have been lobbying some of our elected representatives a bit? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So for the preparations of COP28, we produced a lot of like, you know, background knowledge, which we also shared with the WILPF Environment Working Group. So I think it would be best to basically maybe join the WILPF Environment Working Group, and then with that, you know, address this idea of addressing representatives and what kind of, you know, maybe a small information paper, maybe a 2-pager about the, you know, the main connections would be helpful. Katrin and I tried to do that already a little bit with this document that we shared with the 10 things you should know about demilitarization for climate justice. But I think it's a great idea. We do not want to put too much work, you know, on the shoulders of the delegates now, because it's very intense and they already put so much work in. But if you have the capacity to do so, you know, we're definitely welcoming any ideas.
Thank you.
Yes, Leslie again.
Just to build on what the excellent suggestion, I didn't see who the name of the person who put it, but I think without, and I know that I can sympathize with Michelle from 50 years back trying to talk about environment to some of our key politicians in those days, but maybe 40 years. But Michelle, I think what I understood, and just being practical, is if there could be some key points that were just out to members of WILPF that they could use, or we could use with our own politicians, because this year there's going to be elections in over half of the countries in the world who are democracies. So there's a huge number of, it's a very good time to be really pushing the political parties in the democracies and semi-democracies, and without putting extra work on your team, because you must have your socks burned off doing all the work you're doing. But if there was simple briefing points that we could be dripping in, or everybody could be dripping in to the election processes, now is a really good key year to be doing it. And everybody could do something if we had simple points to be raising. I don't know what other people feel.
Let me show you this document for a second, and let me know if this is what you're looking for. So this is just the document I would mention before. It's basically highlights the key points about demilitarization for climate justice. So it starts with a definition of what we even mean when it comes to demilitarization, but then it goes all over to the key numbers on like military emissions, military spending, but also then, you know, like addressing militarized responses to the climate crisis, for example. I don't know if this is what you're looking for, or if this is already helpful. I can definitely share the link one more time. But if you have other ideas, what, you know, on top of this would be needed, or if it would need to be elaborate, please let me know.
What do other people have some suggestions on this?
This isn't necessarily a suggestion, but I know that there have been quite a lot of resources or infographics and information that have been put out by WILPF International, like on your Instagram and website. So maybe it's worth us as a section having a little scroll through that and seeing what you've already got out. If you think there's anything missing or things that we use to make it a snappy and relevant to
Because
local.
it's still, there is still time to get these points into the manifestos of political parties.
Yes, and WILPF is working on a manifesto, and climate justice is one of our major issues. We're creating this as a manifesto, which could have a leaflet with bullet points to go with it, and the manifesto as a backup. It's something that we will have on our website that we will give to people who are out lobbying in different ways, so that they can challenge those who are looking for power. And we're actually actively working on that at the moment. Could I move a subject a little bit towards the idea of the significance of fossil fuels and the idea which WILPF is behind of an international fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. And we are part of this international movement, and we're part of the NGOs in this country. And I noticed that Global Justice Now is making that, who we work closely with, is making that a focus for current campaigning. What I'd like to ask Michelle about is those 2,400, or however many they were, those lobbyists for fossil fuel, how were they going about their lobbying? Were there things that we could learn from what they were trying to do? Did they try to get people on their own, you know, in the corridors and talk them through and so on and so forth? Or were they, like you, putting in written contributions? Could you elaborate a bit about fossil fuel and the lobbyists?
Yes, so if I would know their strategies 100%, I would definitely try to undermine them somehow. I mean, it's a mix, right? It's a mix between the door conversations, written inputs, but also, you know, meeting and appointments and bilaterals. But that's all things that we as civil society are also already doing. So basically also at the COP, we were waiting in front of delegation offices for delegates to come back, to address them, to talk with them about different issues. We were writing written statements to the different delegates. We have something which is called like kind of guerrilla advocacy, basically, you know, handing out little sheets with paper with like, you know, really concrete ideas on how the text should be formalized around an equitable fossil fuel phase out, and handing it out to different negotiators as well. And there were also bilaterals. So the women and gender constituencies then inviting, you know, or getting together with different member states and then having these conversations about how to address certain priorities in the negotiations. But unfortunately, we're not as well paid and financially supported as the fossil fuel lobbyists, as you know, also these old big huge consultancy firms who are just being hired to basically do these processes for them. So I think there's a lot of like strategies and techniques, you know, we as civil society already established. I think what is oftentimes missing is, you know, funding and the political connections to just have like a bilateral with a high leading person. But just to also go back to what you mentioned on the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, yes, I think that's a great avenue, and WILPF actually believes the treaty to be a climate tool for peace. And during this year's COP, Colombia and Samoa actually endorsed the treaty. And they were basically growing, you know, or joining the growing bloc of different nations. And I think that's an urgently needed, because I think one of the questions, you know, we can also raise is this COP process actually efficient, particularly if we know that there are around 2,400 fossil fuel lobbyists continuously making new fossil fuel contracts. So I think some for answer this as, okay, yes, it is still the most important process, and particularly for those least heard and least listened to. So for those also most affected by the climate crisis, it's an important process to be engaged and to be listened to. But at the same time, we also have to look at other avenues. And as COP is not urgently addressing a fossil fuel phase out, you know, other countries and activists are turning towards the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty as like an alternative to really advance the issue. But I personally think COP is still crucial to engage in. And I do see civil society making a difference every single year. We just need more people, you know, who are actively also putting pressure on the negotiators back at home, not only at the conference, but really, you know, in the work leading up to the COP, really back at home in order to make that difference.
Thank you. Beatrice?
Yeah, hi everyone. Can you hear me well?
Yes, speak up. We can't see you.
Sorry, I have a flu, so I think I'm not gonna turn on my camera. I'm sorry.
It's okay. Just speak up.
Anyway, thank you, Michelle, for such a fantastic presentation. I did attend the COP28 report back webinar with other members of the WILPF delegation, and I remember you delivered a fantastic analysis of the Declaration on Climate Relief, Recovery and Peace from a pacifist and feminist perspective. I do agree with you, it's a very important declaration, but yet very insufficient. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about it, just for the members who couldn't attend that other meeting. And I also have a comment on Sheila's comment, and I'm not sure how official this is, but I'm gonna say it now. As you know, WILPF is also part of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, and the initiative is supporting 3 pilot projects in WILPF sections. One of them is Germany, the other one is Colombia, and the other one is Spain, and I'm also coordinating that project. So maybe that's something that we can discuss internally and maybe replicate some of the activities and proposals that we have, just in case.
Good.
Thank you.
That sounds amazing, Beatrice. And yes, let's please connect on this, because I'm working on the German proposal. So just for everyone else, it's basically the fossil fuel treaty reached out to WILPF asking or demanding if we have like some ideas how to also connect feminist foreign policies with the treaty, and how to get basically feminist foreign policies to endorsing the treaty. And it's really difficult, because particularly also Germany, you know, they basically say, no, COP is the main process. We don't want to engage in another additional process, while other countries like Colombia now endorse the treaty, which is great, because I think there's a lot of learning to do. But yeah, I think that's a very exciting project, and definitely to keep touch on that. Yeah, regarding the Declaration for Climate Recovery, Relief and Peace. So the declaration is super crucial, but it very much focuses on how countries can provide more climate finance to conflict-affected contexts. That's basically the main focus of the declaration, while also recognizing other necessity for climate action in conflict contexts. But it basically always stays on the surface and never really addresses the root causes of the climate crisis, nor the militarization of the climate crisis that we're currently seeing. So, you know, the militarized answers to the climate crisis. Basically, for example, what we're seeing, the militarization of borders, for instance, the securitization of borders, and increasing the money for Frontex and other organizations who are really trying, instead of finding solutions, shutting people out. Or also the militarized responses against indigenous communities who are trying to protect their land. So I think that's, you know, very much missing from this declaration, as well as in general addressing the impacts of that militarization has for peace and security, but also for the planet. And making these links is super crucial. And unfortunately, we see that as well a little bit in the peace community. Not everyone, but a large part of the peace community focuses very much on these on the necessity of providing climate finance or climate action to conflict contexts. But they never really look at how do we actually provide peace, what is needed to get to this peace level in order to not repeat the same thing over and over again, but to really get to the roots. And for us, that's talking about militarization. So yeah, that's unfortunately lacking from the declaration.
Helen Kay.
Thank you for the presentation so far. It's been really enlightening. I was interested in your awareness of the militarization of borders. And I get very frustrated when I see the newspapers just don't take up the question of the movement of people. Because, you know, they're all about the boats or the illegal migrants. There's going to be a massive movement of people for fire, for flood, and for global warming if they have to move from Africa up north. I mean, Scotland, I don't think, has thought about how they're going to share the water that we have. Did this get articulated at COP28?
I would say there is not sufficient awareness about this, also within the whole community that addresses militarization. So they often look at military emissions or military spending, but this connection to a militarization of borders is not sufficiently made. There is a really good report by the Transnational Institute who's looking at this intersection, and they're actually calculating how much money is going to Frontex instead of addressing the climate crisis. I'm definitely going to look for the report so I can send it to you, that you can have a look at it. But I completely agree with you that this is something we really urgently have to address. I mean, most of the climate refugees are at the moment internally displaced or within neighbor countries, but this might also, you know, change in the future. And our response from European countries or the global north cannot be to just build up these borders and spend more money on the militarization of their borders instead of actually supporting those most affected. But it's still lacking.
Thank you.
Leslie again.
Sorry, it's Leslie again. I'm unmuting. I agree entirely with what's been said, but I just want to focus, if I could, as we've got people from the UK here, on the point that we've been making about the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Because as we know, our government right now are dead set on investing in this new North Sea oil and gas. I don't know where the Labour Party, the opposition party, stands on this, but I do think WILPF and all of us individually have an opportunity literally in the next 3 months, 4 months, while the manifestos are being developed, to keep writing letters to newspapers, to MPs, to bringing up the issue, that it makes absolutely no sense. The cost, it's going to take 10 years before it comes on stream. That money could be going into renewables. The government answer is, oh, we're already doing a lot on wind and sea, etc., etc. We know that. But this one issue focused on is, I think, a potential win because of the election coming up and because of the manifestos being, and because of the emotive aspect. And I think if there's any way that WILPF and partner groups could really sort of focus on that one issue in the next few months, it might be useful. That's all. Thank you.
Good.
And I won't put my hand up again. Thank you.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Now, time is moving on. I want everyone who has something burning in their mind to have the chance to ask Michelle, or to make a point, if you have a point to make, in these last few minutes. So please think about what you want to elaborate on. I think we picked up some very useful ideas about how WILPF will move forward on campaigning, how we'll work on our manifesto, the things that we need to emphasize in our manifesto, the idea of getting some leaflets that are drawn on that, and to get out there with the public. So we've got something we're taking forward from that. What else about the COP process? If no one else is going to ask it, can I ask Michelle to say, there's been a lot of ideas around in the media and so on that the COP process is not going anywhere or effective enough, or it has been hijacked, this, that, and the other. But from what you've been saying, there seems to be tremendous amount of potential, both for us as activists ourselves and for us to make some kind of difference at that higher level. Do you want to say something about that in your closing moments?
Sure, of course. Thank you so much. So I think while there is a lot of flaws within the COP process, and definitely challenges, you know, as I mentioned, for example, that we do have 2,400 lobbyists, that we now, the second time in a row, actually have a former state oil executive leading the summit as a president. Now again, as well in the case of Azerbaijan, with Azerbaijan's Minister for Ecology and Natural Resources being appointed. I think these are huge challenges and that we have to face, because there are obviously like conflicts of interest. And while that's the case, I do think at the same time, you know, it is the process still to engage. We currently don't have another process besides, of course, the fossil fuel treaty, which is also important to bring forward, but there is no other process at the moment. And I think what is therefore needed is to really raise the pressure on the countries, do that also nationally, particularly. I think that's really an important process. Because I think at this international level, it's for me, the most important is that those that are most affected by the climate crisis, who are our colleagues from WILPF, from Yemen, from Syria, from other conflict-affected countries, that they are at the conference, that they are listened to and their experiences are listened to, and that we support them. And at the same time, hold our countries like Germany, like the UK, and any other country accountable. And I just wanted to say, you know, or also mention these positive examples of impacts, because we would never have had a loss and damage fund if it weren't for civil society pushing for over 30 years with also the Pacific Island states and the most affected countries for a loss and damage fund. We would have never seen it. We would never have seen a mentioning of a just equitable and transition in the text of the GST if it wouldn't have been for civil society. So just to highlight that yes, we do have also as observers a critical role to play, and we do have impacts on these conferences. And therefore, that's my crucial belief, we can also put the topic of demilitarization for climate justice onto the agenda. But yeah, for that, we need to raise awareness and do that also on a national level. Yes. And just to also say, you know, WILPF had its first official delegation last year. So, and that's something also very special within WILPF International in general, right? That we have like an official elected delegation going to the COP process, which is amazing because I haven't really seen that in any other programs. But last year, we did not yet have any side events. We didn't have a demilitarization working group. And we had the idea, we built the idea of having a peace and demilitarization group at COP27. And it moved from there onwards. We're finding more and more people who are interested in a topic and see what, you know, we achieved right now. We had several side events at a conference, an action, a protest, raising the awareness and visibility in the media. And I think that already shows that we are putting the topic onto the agenda with every step that we're taking. So yeah, that's the encouragement. So please come and join us in the Peace and Demilitarization Working Group. We really need you. And also come and join the Environment Working Group. You can always text me or send me an email, or also Katrin, and then we can add you to the different groups. And there you can find other people who are, you know, really probably also trying to do the same, maybe also in the UK. Yeah, I put my email in the chat.
Well, we've been really, we've had a marvelous evening of tremendous amount of information, very interesting discussion, lots of things for us to take on and move forward with. And you've been a star, Michelle. We're very, very grateful for your presentation, and particularly for the way you've stood in and taken this on at pretty short notice. So thank you, thank you, thank you.